you're in the right place. If you meant to be somewhere else, maybe give it a couple of slides and then you can see what this is about and you can make an informed decision about whether or not you want to stay and hang out with us. All right, so conduct. We're going to be covering some sensitive topics in this conversation. And so I just want to make sure that y'all take care of yourself. If you need to get up, if you need to stretch, do some deep breathing, turn your camera on and off. I can't see you anyway. Have a snack, drink some water, do whatever you need to do to make yourself comfortable during this presentation. Be brave and engage. So if there's something that resonates with you, let us know in the chat. If there's something that maybe triggers you a little bit, let us know in the chat if you feel comfortable doing so. Definitely open to having that kind of conversation. And at the end, we're going to have a writing exercise. You don't have to write. You don't have to. This is your time. And if you want to sit and meditate or research some of the books that I'm going to recommend that you read, you can do that instead. But I hope that you write. So content warning, we will be covering passages today from several nonfiction books. And the topics will cover emotional abuse, sexual assault / rape. In Texas, it's the same thing. Date rape, which is to say rape, peer-to-peer sexual abuse, childhood sexual abuse, incest, kidnapping, and gang rape. And I do want to make something really clear. We are not going to be talking about these events in explicit detail. In fact, most of the authors don't go into explicit detail at all in their books, so as not to traumatize the reader. But I will have to give kind of a background overview of what the book is about in order to make sense of the passages that we will read together. And let's go over author representation too. It's important to know, who is telling these stories, right? Are you going to be able to relate to anybody whose story we will review today? So we have one Asian author, a Latina author, a Black author. The rest of the authors are white. We have mostly female authors. We have one male author and one non-binary author, which is me. And in terms of sexuality, I was amused to discover that it's a 50-50 split between queer and straight authors. That's not by accident necessarily. I'm queer and I like to read queer authors. So, sometimes things happen that way. And then we have three, in terms of sizeism or size differences, we've got 3 overweight authors as well. So disclaimer, while I do encourage you to share in the chat and be brave, I also want to let y'all know I am not a therapist. I'm not a counselor. My undergrad isn't even in psychology. But my experience here is, in my own personal trauma. I have worked in direct services and in prevention services, which is to say educational services, and through careful reading. So trust your own experiences and do what you need to do to take care of yourself. And I will respect whatever you need to do to make that happen. So why should you listen to me if I'm not a doctor, if I'm not a therapist? Well, I have an MFA in creative nonfiction. Specifically, the program that I attended, which is at Antioch University, talked a lot about literary citizenship, which is discussing identity, your own and others, with care and with research. And I have worked previously at a domestic violence agency at a shelter, and I was the community educator there doing prevention work. I was the person who went out to middle schools and high schools, doing attendances. Wait, that's not what I mean. What do I mean? The assemblies. I promise I did do that. I was the assembly person. I just got my A's mixed up. I was also a former volunteer literacy tutor with Reading Partners for 4 years. And I share that because I will be reading some slides aloud to you. I've been told I have an amazing reading voice. Hair flip, you're welcome, But also the most exciting credential that I have is that I am an author of a new poetry collection. Trailer Trash right here, that's my name. That's my book. Isn't that crazy? That is my coworker Claire's plant, and I was amazed by how many of the colors in this pot, complemented my book cover. So she gave me permission to share her plant. Thank you, Claire. And I'm a survivor of sexual trauma myself, and I write about that a lot. So here's the itinerary for what we'll discuss. So the subtitle for this is personal justice, right, for sexual trauma. And that's because we don't always see justice done when it comes to sexual offenses, unfortunately. We'll talk very briefly about the stats. I'm sure that if you're working in direct services or if you're a police officer, that you likely know the stats yourself. So it will be brief, don't worry. We'll talk about reading as empathy. If you're not a writer yourself, I do encourage you to read these nonfiction books that we'll discuss today, or others like it, right? It doesn't have to be these. But it's important because when you read the story of a survivor, that the survivor willingly and intentionally shared themselves, it can give you a unique insight into their experience. And that experience can be invaluable in how you move forward in the world. And then there's writing as empowerment. I'll share passages from these authors' memoirs that explicitly say what writing about their trauma has done for them, right? We'll talk about trauma responses and survivor voices. So we know things like, maybe we'll talk about them. Some of us may know things like dissociation or speaking in second person to kind of distance yourself from the trauma. And a survivor doesn't necessarily know to use that language, right? If they're not in this field, if they're not working in this field. And so they're going to describe common trauma responses in these really beautiful, floral, descriptive ways that might help you hear other survivors better. And then we'll discuss the literary devices and craft that these authors used in order to describe their trauma responses and their feelings and how they navigated the world after their own trauma. But again, we will not be talking about the traumatic event itself. We are not trying to re-traumatize or traumatize for the first time anybody in attendance. And then we will have a free write period, which you can do with whatever you want. So here's the problem. 31% of sexual assaults are reported to the police. That's a little less than 1/3, right?
Andy, I'm so sorry, really quick. We're still on the first slide, I believe.
Oh no, really? Yeah. Oh wow, there have been so many slides since then.
It's like,
wow. Cool. I love when that happens. Okay, hang on a second.
So sorry.
That's okay. Hang on. I will stop sharing. There we go. Why did it happen? How disappointing. Okay. All right, I'm going to try again. We present. All right, thanks for bearing with me. I appreciate y'all's patience. Okay, I'm going to go through and click through the slides so you can see how pretty they were. All right. Can you all see the conduct slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, content warnings, disclaimer, and that's my book with the plant. Thank you, Claire, again. The itinerary. Okay. So why do some choose to report while others do not? So people can report their sexual assault to try to protect their household, to stop an incident from happening again, to improve police surveillance because they feel that it is their duty, to punish an offender, and a couple declined to answer. But why do some choose to not report? So they fear retaliation from the person who hurt them. They believe the police won't do anything about that, which is interesting. I wonder why that is. We'll discuss in the next slide. They believe it's a personal matter and that other people don't need to know about it. They told someone else, felt like they didn't need to tell the police. It wasn't important enough or a big enough of a deal to report. And they did not want to get the perpetrator in trouble. This is pretty common if it's somebody that the victim knows or someone the survivor knows. And they believe the police could not do anything to help. So that's because of the 31% of survivors that do report to police, only 5% lead to arrests, 2.8% lead to felony conviction, and 2.5% will be incarcerated. So whenever it comes to justice or personal healing, right, it seems like it's important to take matters into our own hands, because even if you go forward and report it, there's no guarantee, right, that the perpetrator in your assault or in the assault of somebody that you know will result in quote unquote justice, right? The formal way that we see it. And so writing can be a really personal means of exploring that trauma. And we'll discuss why that's important, right? So from Michelle Boulder, from her memoir, Is Rape a Crime? So in the 1980s, a man crawled into her window in a New York apartment and assaulted her. And her rape kit was never processed. So this is her book about that. She says victims shouldn't have to advocate that their cases be pursued. That's law enforcement's job, and the impact of their disregard is deeply felt. Carmen Maria Machado in The Dream House, which we will talk more about in detail, she writes about the emotional abuse of her female partner. And she writes, most types of domestic abuse are completely legal, right? And so sometimes it's not always as clear as this was an assault, right? There's so many different types of sexual violence, and they're not always black and white. As I often tell my students, the two most important phrases in therapy, as in yoga, are notice that and what happens next. Once you start approaching your body with curiosity rather than with fear, everything shifts. And this is Bessel A. van der Kolk from the very popular The Body Keeps the Score. And so that relates to writing, because there's something that happens specifically when you hold a pen in your hand, when you put pen to paper. There's something physical. It puts you back in your body. But it also gives you a safe place to reflect. The paper is not going to judge you, right? You may judge yourself, and that may be why you have a hard time getting something out, right? Is you're thinking, what if someone reads this? But the paper is not going to judge you. That's a safe place to process your own feelings. When we own our own stories, we get to write a brand new ending. And I know that Brene Brown was not specifically referring to survivors of sexual trauma whenever she wrote this quote, but the moment I heard it, I felt immediately connected to it. And I think it is a beautiful thesis for what we'll talk about today. And I wanted to pause here. Do we have any notes in the chat?
Not so far, no.
Okay, very good. Okay, the first author we'll discuss is Alexandria Marsano Lesnevich, and she wrote this book called The Fact of a Body, and it's incredible. So Alexandria at the time, you know, in the book is, she's a law intern. She had just graduated from law school, passed her bar, and her very first case is doing research for a man who was accused of molesting and murdering a child. And this immediately brings her back into her childhood of abuse. She was molested repeatedly by her grandfather. And so I felt that Alexandria's viewpoint as a lawyer, she is now, right, was a really interesting segue between legal justice and personal justice. She writes, the law, with each side's relentless pursuit of one story, has never known what to do with this complicated middle ground, but life is full of it. And so that's what we were talking about earlier, right? This, not everything is always clear and cut. It's not, unfortunately, because of beliefs around who is entitled to sex, who is not, who is entitled to autonomy over their bodies and who is not. It's not always clear on who, if anyone, has been violated in a situation. In the books, Alexandria writes, I find the thrum of everything unsayable. The characters weep the way I want to, love the way I want to, cry, die, beat their breasts, and bray with life. This to me is a really clear example of how reading can show you the feelings that you may be hiding from yourself, or the feelings that a survivor or victim may be hiding from themselves. Maybe it's not safe to feel your feelings in your body, but it can be safe for another character to feel those feelings. And if you see them reflected, in somebody who's real or not, that can be really powerful and it can be really healing and it can be informative, right? As somebody in direct services. We are prisoners of the story we tell about ourselves, the story of the parents descended from poor immigrants who made it good and now have the Cadillacs and the beautiful, successful children and the most porch lights at Christmas. We are so determinedly fine. It must be overwhelming for them to have a daughter who has suddenly shown up with the marks of all that is not fine so visibly on her. And so this is Alexandria processing that she cannot keep this family secret, right? That her grandfather hurt her repeatedly in her childhood. And she feels this duty to keep it. Before I say more about my own interpretation of this passage, I want to volley this back to y'all. What comes up for you when you read this or when you heard this? What do you think Alexandria is really getting at here? What feelings come up for you? And that's okay. I appreciate your honesty and I appreciate you holding boundaries. I will respect them. So we'll move on. I'll go ahead and say that what I like about this passage is there's a kind of somber bitterness to it, right? There is feeling in it, but it is so removed. So she uses the pronoun we here or this collective we. And I find that really interesting. So it's not just her, it's not this second person removal. It's bringing us into the experience with her. And maybe that's making it safer for her to say this, right? Because it's interesting because it is so specific to her to have the Cadillacs, the beautiful, successful children, from poor immigrants. That's not my experience personally. Somebody reading this is going to relate to this exactly and be like, yes, right? But me reading this, I don't relate to this exactly. And so it is so interesting. But what I do relate to is this feeling like maybe you're the wrong kind of daughter. I'm seeing some things come up in the chat.
Yeah, Jill and Gloria both commented. So yeah, we've got a few people commenting now. If you'd like to read through those.
Sure. Yeah, it's such a commentary on how people want survivors to sweep their pain under the rug. That's so true. Something that really crushes me is it's like a time limit. People put a time limit on how long you're allowed to be sad, right? And whenever it comes to trauma, it's not just I'm sad about this. It's this lives on in my body and I'm going to experience this to varying degrees for the rest of my life. But that's so true. After a while, people get tired of hearing about it, right? Deep, silent, emotionally suffering. I think it's a side as to why many people don't report abuse. Yes, due to fear of breaking up a family. That is so exactly true. Exactly. And so how brave, right? For Alexandria to have written this. So this is Carmen Maria Machado in the Dream House. And I want to talk about the structure of In the Dream House for a second before we move on. That to me is what's really, really powerful about this particular work. It is so fragmented and the metaphor is so cohesive though, right? So she has a one sentence chapter. That quote that I read from her earlier, that is an entire chapter. It said, most types of abuse are completely legal. And that was it. That was the whole chapter. And then the next part is her going into the history of queer relationships and going into, what does it mean to villainize a queer person and who gets to be a well-rounded person, right? And so part of that, the reason that she talks about that is as someone in a queer relationship, she felt somewhat of a duty to sort of shield that from eyes that already felt that relationship was doomed simply because it wasn't heteronormative, right? Like, of course, your girlfriend is going to hurt you. What were you thinking, right? It's just an added layer of victim blaming whenever it comes to queer relationships. I'm seeing some stuff come up in the chat. Okay, yes, depersonalized physical signs that things are not okay, aren't as easy to ignore as internal scars. Oh, so true. You're very poignant. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. So yeah, Carmen says, I speak into the silence. I toss the stone of my story into a vast crevice, measure the emptiness of it by its small sound. So this is about the experience of writing it. And so I want to open this up. What do you think? Why is this such an impactful statement for her to say it like this? I speak into the silence. The stone of my story into a vast crevice. Why is this important? Something that stands out for me in this is vast crevice. She could have said chasm, right? She could have said canyon if she wanted to describe its vastness, but she chose vast crevice, which is an oxymoron. And so the silence, right, is loud, is basically what she's saying here. The silence is loud, but it's also small, right? She's not allowed to take up space in it, right? That to me is what we're talking about here. And in the chat, we're seeing one small voice out of so many that go unheard. So true. Fear of not being heard. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It demonstrates the isolation and invokes feeling. Yes, it does. It absolutely does. Thank you guys. Thank you. So in this scene in particular, they are coming home from a Halloween party, Carmen and her then girlfriend. And so Carmen is dressed as a weeping angel from Doctor Who and did a couple's costume idea, but her girlfriend didn't know who it was, but also didn't want to put in the work of coming up with a Halloween costume or anything like that. So this is them coming home, and it says this. She is still yelling as you stand in the shower, the temporary hair dye swirling creamily down the drain. She is still yelling as you put on your pajamas. In bed, she says, I want to fuck. And you say, maybe tomorrow, and then turn into your pillow, maybe next Halloween will be better. So I included this. P.S. Sorry, I forgot to say explicit language will be in here. That is the most explicit of the language. If you're not offended by that, then we're going to be fine for the rest of the time. Sorry, I didn't get your consent before going forward. So I included this because In the Dream House is about an account of emotional abuse. It is not explicitly about an account of sexual abuse, but coercion is sneaky, right? If you're being coerced outside of the bedroom, I feel like it's likely that things can seep into the bedroom too. And if you feel controlled by your partner, or if you feel afraid of your partner, if you feel intimidated by your partner, do you feel like it's safe to say no? And in this situation, she didn't. She didn't say, I didn't want to, or, this isn't exactly an enticing situation for me. I don't feel good, right? She said, maybe tomorrow. That's the softest no that she was allowed to give, right? In this situation. That's why I felt it was important to share this. In this way, the dream house was a haunted house. You were the sudden, inadvertent occupant of a place where bad things had happened. And then it occurs to you one day, standing in the living room, that you are this house's ghost. You are the one wandering from room to room with no purpose, gaping at the moving boxes that are never unpacked, never certain what you're supposed to do. After all, you don't need to die to leave a mark of psychic pain. If anyone is living in the dream house now, he or she might be seeing the echo of you. Do we know what trauma response this passage is referring to? Or what feeling comes up for you? Yeah, haunting, pun intended. Thanks, Jill. Yeah, thank you for bringing humor. I appreciate that. We're going to talk a little bit about humor in memoir, specifically about sexual trauma here in a second. Loss of purpose? Yeah, absolutely, for sure. Yeah. And isn't that pretty common too, especially as a woman and people who are socialized as women, you're taught to kind of disappear into your relationships, right? That's a normal progression of life. And so if your relationship isn't making you happy, like, what does that mean? You know, do you have a purpose anymore? Which is dangerous. It's dangerous black and white thinking. I'm not advocating for that, but I'm saying it's a common way that women and people who are assigned female as birth are socialized. Yes, Jill, absolutely. This is dissociation. And in a little bit, I'm kind of giving it away, but in a little bit, we're going to talk about another author who describes dissociation in a completely different way. And it's so interesting because it's clear that's what this is, right? You know, Carmen is not in her body. She's feeling like she has to separate herself from her body in order to feel safe. We'll see that later on. Oops, here we go. Okay, this is Jeannie Vanasco's Things We Didn't Talk About When I Was a Girl. So I have included all of these quotes on one slide because they mostly communicate the same thing, but I want to talk about this book for a second. This is a really unique book. So Jeannie Vanasco, this is her second memoir. Her first memoir about her father was really successful, and so she got a second book deal, and she wanted to write about this friendship that she had. She had a male best friend all through high school and then into college, and then when she was 19, she went to a party with him. They both got drunk. He took her to the basement and penetrated her with his hand. And she, you know, the friendship dissolved after that, but slowly, because she was really confused. This was someone she had really trusted. And so years later, I want to say like a decade later, but I'm not positive, don't quote me on that. She reaches out to him to interview him about the experience of assaulting her. And it is vulnerable and gripping. And after I finished it, I mean, points during the book, I had to just stop and stare at the wall and just process my feelings. It is beautiful. I recommend it. Be gentle with yourself as you read. So she writes, why do I assume yet another story about yet another sexual assault can't be told or can't be interesting? This is interesting because in Jeannie Vanasco's case, she's writing specifically with the knowledge that other people are going to read this book. She already has a following and she wants it to be marketable, right? So it's not just the act of writing, it's the act of entertaining, right? And is sexual trauma entertaining? Ellipses, I'll let it hang there. What would the book be without him? I want to include him because without him, the book will be yet another story about yet another sexual assault. And why is that a bad thing, you know? And so the great thing about Jeannie Vanasco in her book is that she shares every thought that she waffles between. She shares all of her cognitive dissonance. So at no point is she claiming just one statement. She is sharing all of her confusion. She says, why do I need his permission anyway? I never gave mine. But she wants him to be an active participant, right? She wants him to be part of this as a means of atonement almost, which is, that's a different kind of justice. This is not something I necessarily would recommend, but this is what Jeannie Vanasco did. I want to understand, I want to believe that it's possible to be a good person, a really good person who makes a mistake, right? And this is at the heart of every true crime podcast I've ever heard of or listened to, which is, you know, why do people do bad things, right? Is there, you know, are some people just evil, or, you know, is it circumstance? What caused someone to do something in this situation? Okay, we're going to pause here. How are we feeling? How is everybody doing in your body? We're going to do what Bessel van der Kolk suggests and notice that, right? We've got 6 more authors to review. After the next 3, we'll do another pause. Okay, very good. Thank you, Gloria. I appreciate you. Okay, if everybody's feeling good in their body, I'll press on, but let me know if we need to take a break. We can do some breathing exercises. Something I didn't mention, I also have a yoga teacher training certificate. I've never used it one time, but today could be that day, you know, why not? First time for everything. Okay, We'll talk about Roxane Gay. This is her memoir, Hunger. So you probably have heard of Roxane Gay from her collection of critical essays, Bad Feminist, or something women. It starts with a D. Anyway, she's great. I love Roxane Gay. I both respect and fear her. I take everything that she says at face value. Okay, I'm seeing some stuff in the chat. Okay, good. Everybody's feeling good. I'm so glad. Whoops. No. Here we go. Okay. So in Hunger, it is called A Memoir of My Body. It's Hunger, A Memoir of My Body. And Roxane Gay is obese, and she writes about the process of gaining weight and how she did it with intention almost. It wasn't quite a surface level thought, but it was a means of keeping her body safe. Whenever she was a girl, a group of boys attacked her and assaulted her. And she didn't tell anybody for a long time. I want to say she was 12 when it happened. And then at 14, she went to a boarding school and she was away from her family for the first time, and she was able to eat as much as she wanted. And she added to her body to make it safer. And we're going to talk about that here in some of her passages. I was swallowing my secrets and making my body expand and explode. I found ways to hide in plain sight, to keep feeding a hunger that could never be satisfied, the hunger to stop hurting. I made myself bigger. I made myself safer. Okay, before we press on, actually, I want to talk about what trauma response are we talking about here? Difficult women. Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Jill. Yeah, it was difficult women I was trying to say. What trauma response is Roxane Gay describing? Yeah, this is emotional for sure. So this is interesting too, right? Because we're seeing, okay, I'm picking up on some internalized victim blaming for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Maybe blaming her body, right? That this is her body's fault. If there is some depersonalization there, but also something that's really common, unfortunately, with people who experience sexual trauma is an eating disorder, right? In a few passages down the road, we're going to talk about the inverse, right? How people can restrict, but either way, controlling food or seeking pleasure from food or seeking safety from food and controlling that food is a means of protection. When you're overweight, your body becomes a matter of public record in many respects. Your body is constantly and prominently on display. People project assumed narratives onto your body and are not at all interested in the truth of your body, whatever that truth might be. Fat, much like skin color, is something you cannot hide, no matter how dark the clothing you wear or how diligently you avoid horizontal stripes. So to me, this last line about the horizontal stripes, that hit me pretty hard as a plus size person myself. But it's also funny too, right? There's like some bitterness in here. And where are women allowed to be bitter? You know, if not in their own writing. There are a lot of ways that femininity is policed, and emotions definitely are part of that, right? But yeah, she's choosing a bitter kind of humor here, and I think that that's really interesting. And what I find interesting too, and we could talk about rape jokes for hours and hours on whether or not they're funny, are they ethical, what does it mean? But she's choosing humor at not her own expense, right? She's choosing humor at the perspective of other people, right? And this part here about they're not interested in the truth of your body. That's like anybody who goes up to somebody who's overweight and is like, you need to go on a diet, you're unhealthy. And it's like, you actually have no idea what that person's health journey is, right? You have no idea about anything about that person, likely. So yeah, we're using some humor here. Is there anything else that people are noticing in this passage? Ah, thank you. Thank you for participating. She mentioned skin color. Exactly. Exactly. So yeah, so something that I didn't mention is that in my current role, so I work at the Jensen Project as the marketing and communications specialist. And the Jensen Project does nonprofit funding for organizations that are fighting sexual violence, in particular, human trafficking. And what we find is that Black girls are often targeted. And we're seeing that perpetrators are even explicitly saying that it is because they believe that they will get more lenient punishment if they're caught for victimizing Black girls, as opposed to victimizing white girls. And so racism in this, it bleeds into everything, right? So of course it would impact the rate of sexual assault as well. I absolutely, absolutely, both racism and fat phobia, we can't talk about sexual violence without talking about oppression, because who has power over whom? Okay, we're going to Lacey Crawford. This is on notes on a silencing. And so Lacey's experience, she went to a boarding school where she was on scholarship, but most of her classmates, their parents were the CEO or high up executive members of really famous brands or things like that. And there was hierarchy there. I mean, not just in, the fact that she was a girl, but also the fact that she was a scholarship kid. And so one night she had two upperclassmen call her and invite her over. And when she got there, they attacked her. And she came forward. She even went, she had a terrible fever. And she went to the school nurse. And they have it on record that she had a venereal disease. There's no way that she could have gotten this disease consensually. That's what they say. And I won't say more because I want you to read it. I don't want to, spoil anything for you. But then they did nothing, right? And then they encouraged her basically to just get over it. Boys will be boys, that kind of thing. So she's writing these notes on a silencing, right? How she was silent, but she's breaking the silence, right? Just by writing it. She says, so I've written what happened exactly as I remember. It is an effort of accompaniment as much as it is of witness to go back to that girl leaving the boys' room on an October night, sneakers landing on the sandy path, and walk with her all the way home. Ugh, that almost makes me cry just to read that. Because, well, let me ask you, what do you see here? What is Lacey talking about in this passage? Aloneness, yes. Influence, yeah, interesting. Okay. What I'm reading here is, yes, more in the chat. Thank you. Yeah, being there for herself when no one else was. Yes, Cindy. Yes, absolutely. This is inner child work to me. She recognizes that no one was there for her during a time when she needed somebody to be there. But in writing this with her present day perspective, with her adult perspective, she can go back and be that safe person for herself. Yeah, absolutely. There's some abandonment here. Yeah. Thanks, y'all. I appreciate your participation. Lacey writes, in bearing witness, we're trying to correct a theft of power via a story. But power and stories, while deeply interconnected, are not the same things. One is rock, the other is water. Over time, long periods of time, water always wins. What I want to know even now is how. So between power and stories, which one is rock and which one is water? And why do we think she chose these two objects, I'll call them, as metaphor? Yeah. Oh, interesting. Power is water and stories are rock. Okay. Jay Walters, care to expand there? I would be interested. While you're typing, yes, those that take the reports have the power, to do or not do anything about it. The water eventually erodes the rock away. See, Jeanette, that was my interpretation also. That power was the rock, that it was rigid. But I like Jay Walter's interpretation. And see, that's the great thing about writing is you can have one intention when you put something to paper, but once you send it out to a reader, a lot of the time you don't get to say, no, that's not what I meant. And does it matter, right? Because if it's still powerful to say that water is the power, and the stories are the rock, maybe sinking in the water, right? There's something to be said about that too. It depends on how we read into it. Around this time, in the first days and weeks after the assault, I became aware of a curious mind's eye perspective I had never held before. I saw myself as if from high above, moving across campus, going from dorm to schoolhouse and back again. I watched myself as a tiny figure being pulled in, as though I were about to be swallowed up. What trauma response are we talking about here? Dissociation again, exactly. And so it's interesting because she doesn't use the word ghost, but you could say that's what this is, right? Carmen Maria Machado explicitly uses the word ghost, walking from room to room. And isn't that interesting? Whereas Lacey describes floating, right? Looking down on things from above, which is a common way of describing dissociation. She doesn't use the word ghost. But yeah, we can read this and know that's what she's talking about, this out of body experience that's common of survivors. Okay. Oh man, I'm so excited. Like I love all these books. I can't recommend these books enough. And I have even more to recommend to you at the end. Katherine Harrison, The Kiss. This book is about how Katherine did not know her father all growing up. And at 20, she met him and he coerced her into a romantic and then sexual relationship with him. And the moment I heard that, I thought, how could it be possible? How at 20 could she be, coerced? What could it mean? But you read it and see, I'm doing it now, the second person thing. When I read it, I immediately understood where she was coming from. I knew exactly what she was feeling, this need to be with her father, to do anything that she had to do to keep him, because she had wanted a father figure in her life her whole life, right? So this is her writing about that experience. Someday a sentence will come to me, a magic sentence that will undo all that is wrong and make everything right. But until that sentence comes, I say nothing. We've got some oxymoron going on here, some paradox. What are y'all reading into this? Yeah, she is saying something by writing. Exactly. So her saying, I say nothing, she's saying that in the present tense too. I say nothing. So is this actually nothing, or is this maybe a part of her that is criticizing, is this going to be anything to anybody? Is this going to matter to somebody else, right? There's nothing that can be said to make it right. Oh, yes. Right? Yes. there's no amount of writing that can undo what happened, right? And so in a way, that's what writing as personal reconciliation seeks to achieve, is this kind of undoing, but you can't. You can only make peace, right? You can only make peace with what happened. My days are as long as despair can make them. This is such a simple phrase, but we've got personification here, and despair is making the days long. And this is, a pretty common, well, it's not a common way, but this is depression. And maybe you hear people with depression describe their symptoms like this, but not using this exact language. And so it's interesting how writing can be at once unique and universal at the same time. The dizzy rapture of starving, the power of needing nothing. By force of will, I make myself the impossible sprite who lives on air, on water, on purity. Pick a word and talk about it, right? Like, just what's coming up for you. There's a lot we could discuss here. Dizzy. Yeah. And what do we think is dizzy about this experience, right? Of being abused as an adult by her father, right? Yeah, there's so many emotions. It's incredibly confusing because you want that closeness, but not like that, right? That push pull. I want the closest, not like that. Emotional whiplash. Absolutely. Yes. Hey, write that down, Jay Walters, because that's a poem. Yeah. So this another common trauma response, right? And controlling food intake, right? The power of needing nothing, right? That her needs for her body had been completely dismissed. And so she's weaponizing that, right? Okay, if you think I need nothing, then I will. And I will make myself the impossible sprite who lives on air, on water, on purity. Something I didn't mention is that her father in the story is a pastor. Dizzy rapture of starving, it speaks to taking her power, yeah, in a powerless way. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's so interesting because I saw this documentary a long time ago in the early 2000s called Killing Us Softly, and it was about advertisements, and whenever heroin chic was popular, just making yourself as rail thin as possible. And something that the documentarian talked about was why women are not allowed to take up space, even in fashion, even in pictures where only a woman is present, we're not allowed to take up much space. Yeah, making herself invisible. And there's safety in that too, right? Like, if he can't see me, man, this is powerful. Thanks, y'all. Thank you guys so much for taking this seriously. And dizzy rapture is like a contradiction of a positive and negative thing. Rapture with a Christian meaning, maybe too. Interesting. I think so. Yeah. So rapture of like maybe being taken away, right? Maybe somebody will come save me. Yeah. And then, yeah, we've got dizzy rapture and then purity of being impossibly thin, you know? Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, and this is a small book. So out of all of them, this is the thinnest one. If you're like, I don't have time to read this one. Okay, checking in again. How are we feeling? Are we good to continue? Okay, I've got one good. I'm angry. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, and thank you for sharing that, because yeah, that's another, of all the emotions that women or people who are socialized as women or perceived as women, right, are allowed to have. Anger is not one of them, right? Bitter is not one of them. Resentful is not one of them. And why is that, right? Maybe angry people are not as easy to control. Okay, this is Lacey M. Johnson, her memoir, The Other Side. Her experience was that she was in an abusive relationship. It became physically abusive, and she left her abuser. And so something that is true and is common, unfortunately, of abusive relationships is that leaving is the most dangerous time, and that was absolutely the case in Lacey's situation. Her ex-partner kidnapped her. And she's so careful about the descriptions. It was a riveting read. I couldn't put it down because I had to know what happened. And then when we got there, she was so careful about how she described what happened when she was kidnapped. So she says the story is a trap, a puzzle, a paradox. Ending it creates a door. What is she saying? There is no end. Hmm. Another opening for other things to come, good or bad. That's very interesting. Yeah, that's true. Without the context of the surrounding information, like we don't know which way she means it necessarily. So to me, this is a survivor's retelling of that Brene Brown quote that I shared earlier. When we own our own story, we get to write a brand new ending. And so the story is a trap, a puzzle, a paradox. You get lost in it, you're trapped in it, you're kidnapped by it, right? The ending it creates a door. And so this is her means of escape, right? She has another work. It's called The Reckonings, and it is a collection of essays. The first one is about the response to her memoir, The Other Side, and she writes about how she doesn't want justice in the traditional sense. She wants a reckoning, in that she wants to be able to be at peace with her own story. Something else too. Well, actually, I won't say that because I'm worried it'll spoil it. So I won't share. The ending creates the door to escape, but to where exactly? Yeah, and maybe this gives some agency back to the survivor, right? Whenever that agency was taken from them. Yeah, maybe at this point, when she finishes the story, she gets to create a door and decide where it leads to. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, okay. That image of the self does not belong equally to everyone. As a woman, I must keep myself under constant surveillance. How do I look as I rise from the bed? And while I walk through the store buying groceries? And while I run with the dog in the park? From childhood, I was taught to survey and police and maintain my image continually. And in this role, as both surveyor and the image that is surveyed, I learned to see myself as others see me, as an object to be viewed and evaluated, a sight. Why are we talking about how women are viewed? Why is that important in a presentation about sexual trauma? Yeah, victim shaming based on looks. Oh my gosh. Yeah, tip of the iceberg. Absolutely. Yes. What were you wearing? You know, what did you do to entice that poor man or boy, right? What else? Yeah, justifying who I am. That's interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting. I appreciate that that word choice, justifying, because yeah, don't women often feel pressured to justify themselves? Women and children are the most common targets. Yes, women internalize these norms. Absolutely. Our worth is in our beauty. Yeah. And doesn't that make you mad? Doesn't that make you so mad? The notion of the perfect victim and how it's a perception. Absolutely. Yes. Ugh. Yeah, I included this because, again, we cannot talk about sexual violence without talking about oppression, because sexual violence is about power. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, Alma. Yeah, I thought that the way she described it was so perfect. This grooming to reach for dissociation, right? Like your whole life, you're taught to look at yourself from the outside and look inside, right? Or people who are socialized as women are taught that, right? And I think that's really interesting, to be groomed into this trauma response, to be taught to reach for dissociation, you know, like it's almost done. Just wait. Ugh. And I want to pause here, you know, as somebody who identifies as non-binary, so neither male nor female, you know, I do recognize, you know, I was socialized as a woman. I was assigned female at birth. But the reason that we're talking about gender so explicitly in binary terms is because typically, you know, perpetrators are male and typically victims are female, but that's not always the case. And sometimes whenever we get lost in those statistics, we can lose the people who are in the margins, right? And so we don't want to do that, but it is important to talk gender because this is, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many experts, a gender-based violence, right? Okay. So I would be remiss if I didn't discuss one of my own works. So this is nonfiction, right? And that this is about my own experience and my own feelings, but this is poetry. And so we're going to talk form a little bit. So this is erasure poetry. And what that means, this has also been called blackout poetry or something else. It's got a third. Maybe Joel can help me out again. So yeah, this is erasure poetry, and that's where you black out everything that you don't want the reader to see. And so to find the title, Search for Me, I blocked out everything except for, so if you'll look to the right, complex PTSD research directions. So I blocked out complex PTSD and I kept search, blocked out directions, kept for, and I blocked out nosology, assess, and I kept me and assessment, right? And then I blocked everything else out. And then for the first line, associate me, drop down here, I kept associate and got rid of D data. So I hope you're following me so far. Please let me know in the chat if you have any questions. And so using the source material about complex PTSD, which you know, can happen to a person. It's not recognized in the DSM-5, but this is something that can happen in repeated acts of trauma, right? If there's repeated trauma, then you know you can have these different kinds of symptoms that vary somewhat to PTSD, but there's a lot of overlap, obviously. So here's this poem. Search for me, associate me, abstract me, extend beyond the main emotion, rage. Functioning for the next decade and beyond is dire, a distinct form of psychopathy. Validate my victimization and do not. Across generations, I, a child, an ass, a pubic hair exposed, developed. I longed for violation called love. Dissociation altered my spirituality. The math of trauma means the average woman is 11 the first time. Validate me and do not. Tell me I am the only one. Tell me sure. Say, yes, you're special. Tell us your suffering has meaning. Okay, I'll press on. We'll talk about Alexander Chee. He is the only male author on our list. So this is an essay, this is a collection of essays called How to Write an Autobiographical Novel. He wrote a novel called Edinburgh, And it is about his own experience being molested as a child by a mentor. And it's interesting because he initially needed to feel that distance. He chose to write fiction. So he changed enough of the setting, he changed enough of the experience. And why did he choose to do that, right? And so the reason he wrote How to Write an Autobiographical Novel is because somebody reached out to him and said, why didn't you write about your own experience? And from his perspective, he did. You know, he did it in a way that felt safe. But he also, in this collection, writes explicitly about his experience, not explicitly in the sense of the trauma, right? Not trying to traumatize anybody, but in naming himself, right? And saying, it was me. I was the one who was hurt. I'm seeing some comments in the chat. Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate y'all. Thank you. To write is to sell a ticket to escape, not from the truth, but into it. Ugh. I mean, so much here, so much here. What do we think? What are we thinking? To sell a ticket to escape, not from the truth, but into it. Yeah, immersion, escape into reality. Yeah, isn't that interesting? And so, okay, I want to talk about this too. So, okay, when my poetry collection was accepted, I got really excited, and I went to my partner who I was really excited, and I was like, I'm going to read you this whole collection of poems. This is going to be great. And I started reading to him, but I did not tell him what it was about. I did not tell him, you know, these are my real experiences. Be gentle with yourself. Like, I didn't check with him to see if he needed a break. I learned a lot from this experience. We got 6 poems into the collection and he was crying, right? And I realized then that, or re-realized, right, that when I write, I am distancing myself from the character of me, right? When I write, it is a form of dissociation so that I can look at what happened in a way that feels safe. And so whenever I'm reading these poems, it doesn't feel like I'm revealing something about myself, right? And so to me, what Alexander Chi is talking about here when he says sell a ticket to escape, right? When we read, a lot of the time it's to escape our current conflict. And it's often ironic because, you know, the heart of a story is conflict. And so if we're reading to escape, we're escaping into a different conflict, right? But in this case, he's writing about the escape is in his own truth, you know? Okay, we've got comments in the chat. Escape into reality, unavoidable reality for sure, experiential reality. Reading others' experiences opens us to worlds where we've never lived. That's so true. Absolutely. So yeah, and you don't have to have shared exactly the experiences of the narrator. And in fact, a lot of the times we read about narrators who experience things that are completely outside of what we could experience, right? But it's this word to me, sell, that is really grabbing me. Sell a ticket to escape. And so it's this like transactional relationship with the story, with the reader, that keeps like pulling me back here, right? Is a story worth anything if you don't share it with anybody? And that's for you to decide, right? Most people misunderstand the crime of sexual abuse. They think of stolen youth, a child tucked under the arm and spirited away. But it isn't like someone entering your house and stealing something from you. Instead, someone leaves something with you that grows until it replaces you. They themselves are once replaced this way, and what they leave with you, they have carried for years within them, like a fire guarded all this time, as it burned them alive inside, right under the skin. The burning hidden to protect themselves from being revealed as burned. You imagine that the worst thing is that someone would know. The attention you need to heal, you have been taught, will end you. And it will. It will end the pain you have mistaken for yourself. The worst thing is not that someone would know. The worst thing is that you might lay waste to your whole life by hiding. There's a lot here. What sticks out? Misconceptions, transferring their hurt onto you. Yeah, that goes back to that saying, like, hurt people, right? The abuser is acting out of a place of hurt, maybe. My survivors, Jill shares, my survivors often have to come to grips with the parts of themselves that have burned away by abuse that will never come back. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think this is really interesting what he talks about here about they leave something with you that grows until it replaces you. The goal is to steal your personhood, right? That seems to be what he's saying. What else? You imagine that the worst thing is that someone would know the attention you need to heal, you have been taught will end you. And it will end the pain you have mistaken for yourself. Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You identify with the pain. If you're, and that can be why for a lot of survivors, feelings are not safe, right? It's because if you identify with your feelings, if you let yourself feel the pain, from the trauma, it can seem all encompassing. It can seem like it will never end. Yeah, absolutely. So this is real, right? Like when people write this stuff in their own voice, again, it's unique and universal all at once. Yeah. Okay, y'all, we made it. We made it to the writing portion. I hope that you are sufficiently inspired. But again, be gentle with yourself. So these are some writing prompts if you choose to write with us. This is what we'll be working on. My goal here, let's see, what time is it? Oh, we got time. We got time. Okay. Yeah, we can do like a whole 10 minutes if we want. Let's do 10 minutes. And yeah, I like that. Okay. So the first prompt is write about a small trauma, small. So on a scale of 1 to 10, the distress this should bring you is like a 3. So think like, what's the most embarrassing thing that happened to you in middle school? And that can be silly, but also that can have some, effects for the future. You can describe a big feeling without naming it. So you can use metaphor, use second person language, which is saying, you feel, you watch, things like that. You can do line breaks in poetry. So where you break the line can manipulate how the reader, experiences that language. You can use run-on sentences. You can use fragments. You can use everything that your English teacher ever told you was wrong. This is your writing. You can describe a trauma response again without naming it. So what does it feel like in your body? If you're writing about dissociation, what was your mind focused on in the moment, right? If not on your body, if not on what happened, and again, small trauma, small trauma, describe that. If you are not interested in writing with us, here are some books to do research on. And I want to stop here and say, please look up trigger warnings. Unlike creative nonfiction, these do go into detail about the abuse a lot of the time, and some of it is, somewhat exploitative. So Any Man, for example, is a horror novel. But the first 2 chapters just made me sob. It just made me cry and cry. And this is about male victims. My Dark Vanessa is about a young girl who was victimized by her teacher. The Power is, I'm sure that maybe you've seen on, I think, oh gosh, I want to say it's HBO, Prime. there's a show about young girls developing the power to like an eel to electrocute things. And there is a wild instance of assault later on in the book that brings a different kind of empathy, or at least I felt that way. But anyway, I'm not going to go through every single book. Please do your research. I just wanted to explain this is different from reading nonfiction. Please be gentle with yourself. I'm going to leave this passage up unless somebody needs me to go back to the previous slide. Let me know. We'll go on for about 3 more minutes. I just want to give y'all a heads up. Okay, let's wrap up. Finish up the sentences that you are drafting. And then I want, what I would love to have happen is for somebody to raise their little blue hand in Zoom. The last time I checked, it was a blue hand. Maybe it's a different color now. Yeah, raise your hand and turn on your camera and/or, well, either turn off your camera and your mic. Wait, y'all know what I'm trying to say. You know what I'm trying to say. I wasn't prepared for this part. If you're ready to share, please turn on your mic, and then you can, if you want to, turn your camera on as well. If you're not comfortable with reading it aloud, you can also share a couple of lines in the chat for me to read. Slash, if you're not comfortable sharing what you wrote because it is a delicate, beautiful thing that is just for you, you can share the experience of having written. How do you feel afterwards? Do you feel empowered? What are you feeling in your body? Oh, thank you, Jill. Yay. Oh, I'm so excited. I'm so excited to read this. I woke up to those words again. Other candidates better meet our criteria. We've chosen not to move forward with your application. They are a punch in the gut, but just a gentle one. I've steeled myself for them. They come often enough. I read the words on my screen, but they translate behind my eyes to "you're too old, you're stuck." They can't see your worth past the year on your transcript. I will not allow that swirl of negativity to make its rounds in my brain, to drop into my heart. Positivity is magnetic, but my hands on the keyboard are wrinkled. Maybe the words are too. Oh, delicate. Those last 2 lines, Jill. Yes. And this is exactly, yeah, you understood the assignment. You knew what you were doing here. Thank you so much for sharing this. I really appreciate this. Yeah. And how interesting that you chose present tense, right? That's very interesting. How interesting that you chose to end with hope. Very interesting, you know? Sometimes the way we choose to tell a story says a lot about who we are. Do we have another brave soul? I don't mean to shame you if you are not feeling brave. That was poor word choice on my part. Do we have another person who is interested in sharing? Ooh, Jay Walters wrote a small story. Do you want to summarize it for us? I'm glad that it was a productive writing session for you. Or you can share the whole thing if you want. It seems like we've got time, you know? It's only a paragraph. Fair enough. You know, a paragraph can be a whole story. Yeah, here we go. Yes. Okay. For every teddy bear, the day you get picked up by a child for the first time is the greatest day ever. Oh, my girl picked me up from a toy store and took me to my new home. We did everything together. She took great care of me. She tied a pretty bow around my neck with a small tag that told the world I was hers. She took me out to play with her and made sure I was clean before bed each night. I never thought we'd be apart. I wouldn't believe that she had ever abandoned me, but that's exactly what happened one spring day. I was in shock, locked in the bottom of a long forgotten toy box. The dark void I found myself in had no beginning and no end. I called out to her, but there was only the sound of my cries echoing on the walls. That is very interesting. That's very interesting. Okay, in this, I'm reading loss of innocence. I'm reading childhood ending too early, right? And that's so interesting that you choose to personify a teddy bear in this experience. And there's some depersonalization in that and being unheard, right? Wow. Yeah. And here we've got some differences between Jay Walters and Jill's story. It starts with hope and it ends with despair. And that's valid too, you know, as writers, you know, you're all writers now. I anoint you. We get to say where the story ends. And there's power in that too, right? There's agency. Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, thank you, Alma. Thank you for celebrating your fellow writers. See, this is what you know, this is another good thing about having a writing community is like there's always going to be somebody to hype you up. There's always somebody who's going to say, you know, that really resonated with me. And, you know, if just one person resonates with what you wrote, then to me, it feels like that had a purpose. You know, that was good enough. And how often can you say that? Okay, it is officially 3 o'clock. Thank you guys so much for sharing. Thank you for participating. This was really cool. Here's contact information about me. If you want to buy my book, you can go to Bottle Cap Press. That's the only place you can buy it. It will take 2 months to ship to you. It's a very small press. It is one guy and his wife. He's doing the best he can. If you really want to do that, or if you want to do the digital copy, it's only $3. You can go to my website at modusoperandi.com. You can email me at modusoperandi@gmail.com. And you can text me if you want. This is my legit personal cell phone number. Please be appropriate or I will block you. Thank you guys so much. I really, really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andy. It's been a really powerful and just great presentation, interactive presentation. And just wanted to remind everyone, if y'all could fill out that evaluation survey I put in the chat, that would be super helpful. And then it looks like Andy also posted all the books that she had quoted through. So take a look at those quickly and you can take a picture of them before we fully log off. But thank y'all. Thank you.